Greetings. So what is Relict? Relict is a tabletop RPG currently in development by Houndsong Games. It's very much in its infancy. It's at a playtest phase. They're very much still looking for feedback, and presumably they will iterate upon it. So for anyone looking at this video in the far-flung future, a lot of the stuff I'm going to be covering today has probably changed, but I mean, I still think that's okay. This video will still be fun. It'll be just like, look what it used to be like, haha. And to like my players and people looking into the system right now, this will still hopefully be a good resource for you. Anyways, the Houndsong people seem like good people. I've interacted with them a little bit on Discord already. I'm very much impressed by their system. I've looked into their sci-fi project. I don't remember what it's called. I'll put it on screen. If sci-fi is your thing, feel free to look into it yourself. Seems like their Patreon money for that is going to a good cause in the form of art assets for the most part. If you're interested in that sci-fi project, do consider supporting them. That being said, what I'm going to cover today is Relict. So let's do that. Relict is a system akin to 5e. Some could say 5e-like, but I think that it is very distinct in quite a few ways that beyond just like legally distinct and whatnot, I think that it would be considered a unique experience. For instance, this silly prop is useless. Bruh! Okay, I'm not actually gonna do that. But the fun thing is, this system uses D12s. We need this, not that. Evil. Alright, so the D12s allow it to have an expanded crit rate, right? Because you obviously crit on a 12. Normally you have a 5% chance of hitting. On a D12, it's like a 8-point-something% chance of hitting. Critical hitting, right? And to compensate for that, they have what are called fate points. When you crit, you can choose to do the cool crit effect, sure. Or you could bank it as a fate point. And then you could spend one or more on fate options, depending on what that is. So that idea that like those more explosive turns with critical hits and whatnot are more likely, and that you can also bank that for versatility later on, I think is impressive and definitely is something that 5e can't offer. It also allows you to design around that idea of that nat 12, more so than 5e and other systems have been able to design around the nat 20. Beyond just that, the 6 stats, right? Strength, Dex, Con, I believe it then goes Int, Wisdom, Charisma, in that order, normally on the lineup on the sheet. Those have been reworked. There are equivalencies in this systems. There's similarities, right? But each of those distinct stats have been reflavored and reworked into I'd say a new and better light, right? For example, some of the things that were once covered by the Dex stat, like acrobatics, that could be governed under the might stat now. Might is more representation of physicality, whereas the equivalent to dexterity is now precision, and precision now governs a lot less. So in 5e, you had this problem where basically everything was tied to dexterity, and it was just like the best stat in the game. It seems as though some of dexterity's roles are being divvied up amongst the other stats. I've also seen that for Wisdom. Their willpower seems to have some of its stuff divvied across the other stats. Their charisma is a lot more clear and makes more sense, at least to my brain, than 5e's iteration of charisma. When I get to that section, we can talk on it more. And I mean, honestly, just read it. But at the very least, like they're doing something new with the stats that I like. There's a lot of small tweaks along the way that makes it easier to run in this system, and I think innately teaches you how to run better games. I'll get to some of that later on. So those of you who are build monkeys might be wondering to themselves, what do the classes look like? What do feats look like? And so on and so forth. I haven't done the deep dive there. That being said, it does seem as though you have 2 classes and like an influence to those classes. It's they say that they've designed it for multi-classing in mind, but I see it less as multi-classing and more of it like modularity. So it does look as though there will be some build versatility, but it's less like 5e does it, where it's like you have your primary set of things, and then you take from other areas where you can. It does seem as though that more taking from other areas is baked into the core of any given character. The character's, core class is a lot less decentralized here, is my impression so far anyway. For combat, it does seem to run similar to 5e. They have overhauled the damage system, which I think I like. There's some elements of it that I don't like that I'll cover later. That's it for the broad strokes. All right, let's get into the specifics. Something I alluded to before was that the primary die is a d12. There are some things that de-increment that to a d10, a d8, d6, and so on. But for the most part, you're going to be rolling that d12 when it comes to your checks and whatnot. There's a section that talks about recommended materials, like needing extra dice. It does seem as though they do want you to have scratch paper or some way to take notes, some way to track capabilities. There are resources for printing out a character sheet if traditional pencil and paper is your way to go. I think that it might be fun to track the unique HP tables with maybe like a bead on a printed out sheet. Alternatively, I think that it would be nice, at least until virtual tabletops adopt it and make like a proper little character sheet for it. It would be nice for online players to track their HP on like an Excel sheet, right? That is then shared with the DM so they can have reference to it. But at the very least, there does need to be like a certain willingness to get your hands messy, right? To track things. But I mean, that's how every system's like, including 5e. That's nothing new. If you're an experienced DM or player, you won't have any problems there. I'm going to cover the core stats again real quick. We have might, we have precision, we have cleverness, we have knowledge, we have willpower, and we have fortitude. Different order, but fairly equivalent, right? Small changes, as I covered before, might more so covers athleticism and physicality. It's not just about strength. They've got a little bit of a buff to it in that regard. Mechanically, might is used by melee open attacks, by physical abilities. It's also used to calculate stamina capacity and stamina regeneration. Skill checks and proficiency bonuses and whatnot aren't a thing in this system. So let's say that someone wanted to make an athletics check or an acrobatics check. Instead, you would just make a might check. It's just nice and simple and easy now, right? You just assign which of the core stats fits best with what you're trying to do. I want to be able to lift weights above what would be normally possible, make a might check. I want to be able to climb this near impossible object, make a might check. I want to push the rusted lever to open the trap door, make a might check, right? Pretty standard fare. So strength to hit is pretty familiar. An area that probably wasn't very familiar was the idea of stamina capacity and stamina regeneration. What that means is that not all of the, but a good chunk of the actions, and I assume some like class-specific actions, require the consumption of stamina as a resource. A set amount of stamina automatically regenerates at the beginning of your turn, so it is a resource that gets renewed, but it is still a finite resource. For example, the default attack costs 1 stamina. You roll your d12 plus your might, bada bing, bada boom, maybe you hit, right? If you wanted to spend beyond just that 1 stamina, though, you could add one of 2 modifiers to that attack, either the careful attack modifier or the power attack modifier. The careful attack modifier boosts accuracy. Basically, for each 2 stamina spent, in addition to that plus 1, you get to add a 1 to that attack's roll. To that attack roll total. There we go. I got there. You could, of course, keep spending 2 stamina at a time, and you'd get like the following example, right? Let's say that you had a, +3 from your might. I don't know how reasonable that is. Maybe that's pathetic. Who knows, right? But let's say your default was a +3. Instead of spending 1 stamina, You spend a total of 3 stamina on that attack. You decide to do careful attack. Now instead of rolling a d12 plus 3, now you're rolling a d12 plus 4. Let's say you wanted to spend 5 stamina. Now you're rolling a d12 plus 5. There you go. The same is true for power attack, but in this case, it's adding onto damage instead. You can't do both. You can't base boost both your accuracy and your damage. You do have to choose, right? So there is that bit of risk reward there. It's just like, oh, do I really want this to hit? Damage be damned? Or is it, do I want to risk it for the biscuit, but deal some extra damage, right? So, you could also potentially run out of stamina. I'm not sure exactly how often that would occur. I would imagine though with good resource management, you would probably at least have some spare stamina every now and then for an attack. Or again, a lot of these other things consume stamina as well. Grapple consumes a stamina. Shove consumes a stamina. That's all I'm seeing. I know there's other things though. Okay, I found it. Jumping and opportunity attacks are also things that consume stamina. And I know there's even more beyond that. Having a high stamina capacity and stamina regeneration, at least for me, on a warrior type character, I do think that sounds important. So you do need might. That being said, if you do want to play that classic dex character, precision is the equivalent for dexterity. It does appear as though there will be finesse type mechanics here, so you might be able to do precision to hit for your dex based weapons, right? But of course, as I said before, might is still the default, and I don't know how often that support for precision will come up. But at the very least, it is the stat that by default governs ranged weapons. Also, it by default governs thrown weapons. That's a change as far as I can remember. Is that thrown weapons use precision? Maybe there'll be rules that reverse that, right? Your bruiser of a barbarian. Your bruiser of a barbarian. There we go. Your bruiser of a barbarian may want to use might instead, and perhaps he has fun mechanics on one of his classes that allows him to do so, right? So I don't know if that will end up getting reversed or not, but by default, precision is a stat for ranged weapons and thrown weapons, right? Beyond that, if you read its description, it's not just about dexterity now. It can also be used in tracking, scrutinization, that sort of thing. Craftsmanship as well. So I would imagine calligraphy would be a precision check. I would imagine stealth is still a precision check, right? And it also improves your armor class. I mean, there's no escaping that. Precision, dex to dodge out of the way, it is what it is. So, the dex stat was nerfed effectively, but not to the point where it's not necessary. Not to the point where it's not still worth taking. It very much still is worth taking, and if you wanted to play some sort of archer, it seems as though it is your big stat, right? But at the same time, it's not like the overpowered dump everything into dexterity type of a stat that it was in 5e, and I really appreciate that. All right, so cleverness. Cleverness is not charisma, not quite. It is definitely the equivalent here of charisma, but it does cover a broader range, and it's flavored a little bit differently. Beyond just the normal slew of performing and lying and convincing people and being persuasive, that kind of thing, it is also the stat that would be used to deal with traps, right? How clever you are at figuring out those mechanisms, how clever you are at solving riddles, how clever you are at seeing patterns in things, right? It does have some distinct flavor to it that, in my opinion, sets it apart from charisma and fixes a lot of the problems I had with charisma. That you don't necessarily have to be a pretty character to be a charismatic character. In this system, cleverness has nothing to do with whether or not you are pretty or charming, right? You could be a clever person who is good at solving puzzles or the like, and not necessarily a pretty character. I'll stop doing that. But anyways, it is the stat used to interact with esoteric devices, see through lies, trick or convince NPCs, and provide a bonus to some spells and abilities. So there is still intent to use it as a casting stat There will still be charisma casters or cleverness casters in this particular case. It doesn't seem like it'd be useless either, which, again, the trend continues. The stats, in terms of the role they play in the diverse builds and whatnot, all seem balanced and useful. I'm very happy. And knowledge? Knowledge is the nerd stat. Get out of here. Go on. Silliness aside, it is your intelligence equivalent, right? Not only does it govern areas of knowledge and the arcane, but they also make mention of science and engineering, even trivia. The likelihood of unearthing useful information. There we go. Yeah, that sounds good. It's not just for wizards. It is now useful. Like, it does say that there are spells and abilities that benefit from it. So, like, it is still good for whatever the wizard equivalent ends up being. But it is also what first aid is scaled to. And the first aid action looks very important. Healing is not just a cleric or good themed caster type thing, right? It's not just for your bards and your druids and whatnot. First aid is something that any character could do, regardless of their magic. It's governed by the knowledge stat, right? And I think that for that reason, having at least one or two high or at least decently knowledgeable characters in the party may end up being necessary. I'll go into why when I go over what the first aid stat does and when I go over the damage system. But at least in terms of like the meta of keeping your characters alive, I think that first aid is very important and that the knowledge stat should not be overlooked. Grim foreshadowing aside, I offer you willpower. No longer are paladins bound to cleverness, or charisma rather. Now, zeal is included, conviction is included under willpower, our wisdom equivalent. Beyond that, the words used here are mental strength, emotional robustness, willful characters can resist magic. So like, the idea of a lot of spells proccing wisdom saving throws, it seems like that's still going to be a thing, right? It is still your will against the magic of your enemies, their vile spells, right? Will is still like your big, I shrug off your charm, and I'm focused on getting what needs to be done, right? Willpower still is that important stat. Beyond just protecting from harmful effects, it also increases your mana regeneration. So, to a degree, I would say that regardless of what your magic casting stat is, willpower is an important stat. Now, some of you eagle-eyed viewers might have realized that I only said mana regeneration, and that when I was talking about stamina before, I talked about not just regeneration, but capacity. That's right. Fortitude, your constitution equivalent, governs mana capacity. That's right. Constitution is a casting stat, and that makes me very happy. I'll go into fortitude in just a moment, but focusing on mana regeneration and mana capacity, you might notice that this isn't locked to just casters. This is something that all characters have. By default, this setting assumes that your characters have some degree of magic about them. Maybe they do actually specialize in it and they take like casting classes or stuff that kind of pushes them in that more direction. Or maybe they just have like a few magical tricks. They just dabble in it. There is reference to characters that have no magic. It's a possibility, or at the very least that appears to be the intention. But then a later section on character creation sees you grabbing from a mage class and a martial class. Right? So then it makes me wonder, is that ruling like an optional rule? Is that up to the DM? If the characters did want to play a character with no magic, could they have the option to just take 2 martial classes? If someone wanted to play like a magic specialist or a prodigy of some kind, could they take 2 mage classes? My assumption would be yes, because there's language here in the core that suggests that. It's just there's not currently language at that other section that suggests that. So you certainly could be a character that doesn't do spells. That being said, you still have mana. That is still a resource that you can spend on some of your innate skills and abilities and whatnot. And I imagine that even some non-magical classes might still have things that they would spend mana on, right? There's also counterspelling. Which looks like it's going to be pretty important. I'll get into that in a second. I know that some 5e people are very scared of Counterspell, right? They're like, oh, that's the spell that breaks our table and makes us not have fun. I think that this system handles it very well, especially by baking it into the core rules. I'll get to that. Don't be afraid yet. We'll get to that. So I promise we talk about Fortitude. Beyond just that cool little mana capacity thing, it also plays a part in armor class. So it's not just dexterity that's added to armor class. It seems as though Fortitude will as well. It's also, of course, like the big common like physical resistance attack. So yes, it is still used to make your con saves, right? To endure something. The flavor text talks about enduring hardship and that more traditional constitution type of a flavoring to it, but it also talks about it governing your magical capacity, so to speak. Specifically, the character acting as a conduit for more magic than they otherwise could have, right? That's probably just a flavor reference to the whole increased mana capacity, but it is an interesting distinction that to a degree Fortitude's not just like physicality, but it's also a little bit internal strength as well. I've touched on it before, I'm going to touch on it again. Skill checks aren't a thing, skill proficiencies aren't a thing. That being said, whenever someone wants to attempt something and a roll would be adjudicated, right? You instead do a fortitude check or a willpower check or a might check and so on and so forth. You want to pick some locks? Maybe that's precision, maybe that's cleverness, really depends on the kind of mechanism we're dealing with here. You want to move a boulder? Might, right? You want to understand this tome you're skimming through? Knowledge. You want to pick out a specific key phrase? Maybe that would be cleverness. Maybe that could be precision. Could still be knowledge. That's up to DM interpretation, right? But basically, your skill checks have been kind of simplified to these 6 categories. Now, how high these stats are for any given character is determined by their class choices, and then they do have like some free points to spend. But basically, they don't tend to get really big, at least not early on, or at least that's not what I'm seeing. Maybe later on there's options for that, but skimming that character creation content, it seems as though you have a very finite amount of resources to determine your ability scores, or core stats. And some of that is determined by your class options. That being said, the human max is 10. It goes from 0 to 10. So 10 is only the cap for humans, right? For player characters, pretty much. There are all sorts of NPCs or creatures out there that can exceed that. Examples given is that a gorilla might have a might score of 11, a sphinx or an archfey might have a knowledge or cleverness score approaching 20, and then I personally would assume that a dragon probably has plenty of stats exceeding 10. Ability score stuff aside, let's get into what happens when we get into combat, right? Initiative is still pretty much the same, except there's no modifier. It's just a flat D12. Maybe some class or feat equivalent gives you an exception, but at least by default, it's just a flat D12. I think I like this simplification, but I guess if you wanted to homebrew in that it goes off in precision for you and your table, fine, right? If that's something you end up missing, fine. But otherwise, by default, D12, I like it. If you're worried about tiebreakers, because the die is smaller and there's no modifiers, tiebreakers are more likely. There are rules for tiebreakers, so you can resolve that using those rules if you choose. If not, I'm sure you could just do an easy, Bob, do you want to go first or do you want to let Jim go first? Jim can go first. There you go. It's just that simple. But otherwise, yeah, there are rules there if you care for it. Combat is also where it stops being as close to 5e as it has been so far, and instead starts to take from Pathfinder 2e a little bit, or at the very least Pathfinder 2e's playtest. I haven't looked into the published 2e proper all that much, but at the very least in the playtest, the system was reminiscent to this. In Relict, you have the start of your turn, right? Those are where effects that says at the start of your turn this thing happens. That's when those things go off. You have your recovery step, where you'll regenerate some of your stamina and some of your mana. That's determined by your, calculated on your character sheet, determined by those stats we covered before. Might for stamina, willpower for mana, right? After recovery step, you then have 2 actions, right? Those actions can be used to do a number of things. We'll get into that in just a second. Then, of course, you have the end of the turn, where anything that says at the end of the turn, that those effects trigger. It's pretty simple stuff, for now at least. When we get into the actions, here's where things get a little bit more deep. You might have noticed I didn't mention bonus action, or movement, or free action. Those aren't really an option. Free actions do exist. Grappling references them, and I know there's a few other areas where free action is referenced. So while it wasn't officially on that chart, there is precedent for free actions to exist. There's also like some language during the universal actions section that talks about whether or not they can do something as a bit of a freebie, right? So that's still up to the DM ultimately, but there is precedent for free action. Now, where did movement go? Movement is now an action. So move is pretty simple. You move up to your speed. There is a language in here that does let you attack and do stuff in between your movement. That's totally fine. There is no really dash action. In this case, it's just I move with my first action and then I move with my second action. So you can still dash action. It's just different language. I did go into attacks already. It's pretty simple. It's just your D12 plus might if you're doing melee, precision if you're doing ranged, and I would imagine that there may be some exceptions thrown in there depending on your build and class and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, if you're bonking them, it's might. If you're hitting them from afar, it's precision. It's just that simple. They can be modified by the careful attack status or the power attack status. You do have to choose that. I would say that is chosen when you declare the attack. The way it's formatted anyways, it seems as though that does need to be cleared ahead of time. Or at least that's what I believe the intent of the design to be. In that you attack, and do you want to attack carefully or powerfully? And then if you want to do neither, then that's fine too. It just costs 1 stamina, easy peasy. You might have noticed that spell attacks aren't governed there. They do say that is governed by the information on your character sheet. What sort of class abilities your character has access to. Some of them may have the ability to cast a spell as an action. Some of them might have the ability to use an ability as an action, right? There are, of course, more things you can do than just attacking. Right now we're going over the core of what all characters are capable of. Fringe specific stuff, that's another day, possibly another video. We'll see. Next up on the list is the use action. Yes, drinking a potion is still an action. That being said, you do have those 2 actions, so that's not that bad. Administering a potion, there is precedent for that right here in the core rules. I like that a lot. Interacting with a complex object or device. So for an example from earlier, if you're pulling that rusty lever, right, that might be a use action. Here's where some of that language about free actions comes into play. It does say that drawing an equipped weapon from a sheath is usually free, but that it comes into like the DM's purview, right? Sometimes they're going to say, no, I'm sorry, that is complex enough that you do need to use the use action. Other times you're just like, yeah, sure, you could draw your sword, it's whatever. But at the very least, there is a language in here that should hopefully make drawing weapons and grabbing potions from backpacks and whatnot a free action. Or at least that's my interpretation of it so far. But administering that potion, or even just taking that sippy yourself, nah, that's a use action. That's clear. No free sippies for you. So the next one detailed is first aid. I'm going to skip first aid for now because I think it's very important to combat. I think it's very important to damage during combat. There we go. And I want to cover that later. So after that, we have hide. Hide is pretty normal, right? You make your precision check to conceal yourself. If they are paying attention, maybe their passive detection is high enough and they can just automatically notice you. If not, then search action is a thing. They have to make the search action. That's also something you can do. So if the enemies hide from you, maybe your passive will detect them. Maybe you gotta search for them, right? But you got your hide action, you got your search action. Pretty standard stuff. Neither of them consume any stamina, by the way. Those are just things you can do for free. Same with the use action and with the first aid action. Those are also things you can do for free. However, the shove action does cost a stamina. In this case, it's pretty simple. You make contested might rolls, you and that target. If you win, they get pushed 5 feet away. There's no shoving them on the ground, so that they're prone and you get advantage. That's not a thing here, but you can still shove them away from you, right? So if someone's standing next to a cliff, you can still shove them off a cliff. Could you shove them on the ground and then dogpile them? Not by default. Maybe there's a feature at some point in time that allows for that kind of mechanic, but at the very least, the default shove action has been nerfed. You can push them away. That's that. Grapple is another generic action that costs 1 stamina. Nice and simple. You get to make your might roll against their might roll. If you succeed, their speed is 0. If you move, they move with you, so there's precedent for you dragging someone somewhere. It does have your speed, of course, while you're grappling it. Neither of you, not just you, they can't either. Neither of you can make ranged attacks or cast spells that have somatic components. So that's the fun hand-wavy stuff. The Doctor Strange sigils in the air, that sort of thing. They can't. If they're grappled, you are actively disrupting at least a portion of their spell list, right? So grappling it seems very useful. It's not as powerful as before, but it's still very useful. You can also ungrapple for free at any time. This is another mention of the free action here. Releasing the grapple, done, easy. Readying an action is still a thing in this system. It's now called the wait action. It basically works the exact same thing. You set a condition. If that condition goes off, you get to do your specified action. It does have a limit of 1 wait per round. So to me, that sets the precedent that you can't, of course, then wait twice with 2 actions and say, I wait for event and then I wait for other event. You pick 1 event and you get to do that cool action. And if you didn't end up using your second action on your turn, well, so be it. So you can delay your action till later in the round via this action. There's not precedent for you delaying your entire turn till later in the round, at least beyond rolling initiative. Something I forgot to cover when I was covering initiative is you can delay your turn on that first round, but it does specify first round, which to me denotes the intent that that's not something you can constantly do. It's just the opening round of combat. You're just like, I would like to go after Jim because I know he's going to cast Fireball, and I don't want to be in the middle of that Fireball, right? Done. Clean. Simple. Don't got to worry about it anymore. I'm sure DMs could rule otherwise, unless more specific wording is applied. But by default, it seems the intention is that you can only really delay your turn on that first round of combat. Past that point, you can't. You could, of course, still take the wait action, where you say, hey, I'm going to wait for this to happen, and then I get to do this in response. That's still a thing, but otherwise, it is just the turn 1 is the only time when you can choose to delay your full turn instead of just that action. Hopefully that's clear. Channeling is the next action on the list. Similar to First Aid, it's a bit crunchy. I'm going to save it for later. Yeah, I think it'd be better to understand how damage works and how afflictions work, so we can fully understand the risk-reward nonsense going on here with channeling. So we're going to save it till after I've covered some of that stuff. That being said, I'm more than willing to now cover jump, right? Jump is an action. It costs your movement and it costs stamina. You can choose to effectively do a long jump or a high jump. It's pretty simple stuff, except math-wise. Math-wise, it's a little bit not simple. Never mind, take that back. Jumping's not simple, but the delineation, the choice between how you jump and whether or not you jump, that's pretty simple, right? Let's say you're doing a long jump. You can spend half your speed and 1 or more stamina. We'll get into that in just a second. You're able to then jump forward 1/3 of your speed. So you're giving up half your speed to jump 1/3 of your speed. So you end up jumping a little bit less than, of course, what you're giving up. But the payoff, of course, is that you are now aerial, right? That ideally that gives you something. If not, then why are you wasting your action and some of your movement instead of just walking there? So presumably the long jump is doing something for you there. But otherwise, yes, it maths out that you don't get to jump as far as the resource you gave up. Sorry. If you do want to try and approach that number, you can at increments of, let me see. There we go. At increments of 1 stamina, you can increase that distance traveled by 5 feet up to a maximum of half your speed, right? So that half that you gave up, It was at 1/3. You can increase that back to half by spending however many points of stamina you need to get back to that point. But you can't then jump further than that half you gave up, right? You can only get back up to that point. As far as your high jump goes, you jump vertically based off from what your creature size is. So small people get 6 feet off the ground. Medium creatures get 10 feet off the ground. Large creatures get 13 feet off the ground. If you want to spend a ridiculous amount of additional stamina, in this case 4, not just 1 this time, 4 additional stamina, you can increase that reach by 2 feet, which, yes, would be significant. The wording here is reach an object up to 6 feet, and so on and so forth. It implies that this would include your arm being reached, right? You are trying to jump up to something. You're trying to grab the rim on that basketball hoop, right? That's what's determining how high you're jumping. Let's say that the small creature by default cannot grab that basketball hoop. They could then spend a bunch of stamina to increase by increments of 2 feet, and now they can dunk. It's just that easy. That sure is becoming the catchphrase of this video, isn't it? It's just that easy. Oh boy, I sure seem to have a nervous tick phrase. That's fun. Anyways, swimming. Swimming is... yeah, just need to double check. Swimming is not an action. You just get to swim for half your speed. There are rules involving like holding your breath and drowning and whatnot. It does seem as though that's a lot simpler here than in 5e, but I don't care to cover it. So we're going to move on to climbing. Climbing is also pretty simple, at least if you're climbing in simple mode. Simple. You climb at half speed, right? If it's a difficult climb, then you climb at half speed, and we get to make some might checks and determine some fancy biscuit stuff. There's also a third category, dangerous. You have simple climbs, difficult climbs, and dangerous climbs. Let's dive into difficult climbs first. When you make a difficult climb, it's governed by a number of rounds. These rounds are determined by your might check. So, when you first attempt that difficult climb, you make that might check. If you can't move, of course at half speed, up from the position to the top to wherever it is you are going, by the time you exceed those rounds, one of 2 things happens, right? Maybe you're at a safe rest spot, and you're good to go, you take a breather, and then you start climbing again. Or maybe there's an ally within reach who can catch you and hold on to you and keep you from falling. That would also effectively serve as a rest spot. But for each round that they compensate for your failings, they have to mark one of their own climbing rounds off from themselves. If you aren't at a safe rest spot, and if you don't have an ally to catch you, you just fall, and their fall damage is a thing. So try not to do that. Let's go over this real quick again. You do your might check. That tells you how many rounds you have to make it there. Your rounds consist of you moving at half speed. You either got to a rest spot, or had an ally you could rely on. Failing that, you fell down, right? It sounds complicated, and it kind of is, but I think that after you experienced it a few times at a table, you'd get the hang of it. At the very least, I don't think I'd have too much of a problem slowing down the pace of the game to pull out these difficult climb rules at my table. I definitely would need to reference the rules and have them in front of me and do that kind of math of how many rounds and how much movement and whatnot. So it definitely is a slowdown, but it's not that egregious. Dangerous climb is when things kind of get a bit more chaotic. Now it's whatever the DM deems appropriate. The language of dangerous climbs uses the word segments, which isn't clearly defined. If I can find an answer on their Discord server or ask them, I'll pop that up on screen, right? But otherwise, it seems as though those segments might be certain rounds akin to how difficult climbing was defined, or perhaps it's just arbitrary, right? Where it's just this scaling this particular cliff wall is dangerous. It has been raining. It is slick with rain. I would require 3 segments of rolls. In that case, then, they would make 3 might checks. The DM, of course, sets the DC for them, and if they complete each segment, they get to the top. There's also precedent in the wording here for applying penalties or bonuses for assistance, depending on the GM, right? So if you've got a buddy at the top that's tossed a rope down to you, presumably that rope is going to make it a lot less dangerous. Maybe it applies, I don't know, a +5. Maybe that's too generous. It depends on the scenario. If you do have it where it's like, oh, it is raining and now suddenly the torch you were carrying has spooked the bats. The bats are now in your eyes. You now roll those checks with a -2, right? That sounds reasonable to me. But that's how dangerous works as far as I'm interpreting it. To me, it's not clear. But it still seems as though regardless of how clear it is still up to the DM. So my interpretation of it right now is DMs make it somewhat in line with the rules for difficult, but also you can do whatever bullshit you want. That's my personal interpretation right now. Things might solidify. Maybe I got that ruling and I'm gonna show it now, or I already showed it. Who knows? But this should give you an idea of what the difference is between a simple climb, a difficult climb, and a dangerous climb is. Again, simple is just half speed, no checks, you just make it, you do it, everything's fine. Difficult is there are checks, maybe you fall, there's mechanics for that. Dangerous is the same, but also the DM makes stuff up, and you probably are gonna fall. And when that falling occurs, we have falling rules. The falling rules are pretty detailed, but minimalistic. There's a lot of numbers being thrown around here. Your fall rate is 900 feet per round, or 150 feet per second. Falling damage is dealt according to the distance fallen to account for acceleration. And then we have 3 different categories. Basically, if they fell less than 30 feet, they take 2 kinetic damage for every 10 feet fallen. So in this case, let's say they fell 20 feet. That would then be 4 kinetic damage. Let's say they fell 10 feet. That's just 2 kinetic damage. If they fell the full 30, there you go. That's 6 kinetic damage. So that's if they're under that 30 feet threshold. Let's go to the next threshold. Between 31 feet and 1,800 feet. 1,800 feet. 1,800 feet. There's another way to say it. All right. You get it. Between 30 and big smush, you take 1d4 kinetic damage for every 10 feet fallen. So let's say 60 feet. Now suddenly that is 6d4 kinetic damage, right? Nice and simple. Now, the final category, the you get smushed category of falling more than 1,800 feet. Terminal velocity, take 3d100 plus 200 kinetic damage. I'll need to double check the kinetic damage chart, but I'm pretty sure you just die. Maybe there's some sort of like high level or like fancy feature you can have that will protect you from dying from that feat, but I'm pretty sure this is a joke rule. And they just assume you're dead. They assign D100s to be funny. Think about that though. Even if on each of those 3 D100s you rolled a 1, that's still 203 kinetic damage. If we assume average, you rolled a 50, right? So that's 350 kinetic damage. I'm pretty sure you're just dead. This is a joke rule in my opinion. But yes, those are your 3 tiers, right? Less than 30 feet, small increments of 2 damage. Beyond that, D4s of damage. Beyond that, you die. It's just that simple. Some of you probably noticed that I didn't mention reaction before. That reaction was not a resource you had. Reactions are in this game. They just work a little differently. The first named reaction is Opportunity Attack. This one doesn't cost a whole lot. It just costs 1 stamina. You get to attack your guy that moved out of your range. It works just like in 5e, but it doesn't cost a reaction. Instead, it just costs a stamina. That's it. Retreat does cost a little bit more. You will end up losing one of your actions on your next turn, but it doesn't cost any stamina, right? So, differentiating, opportunity attack costs a stamina, but doesn't do anything to your actions. Retreat does do something to your actions, but on your next turn, so you don't have to worry about that quite yet. Now, what does retreat do? After taking the damage, you may use your reaction to retreat, moving up to half your speed directly away from the damage-dealing source without incurring opportunity attack from that source. So, in short, you get hit by the bugbear, right? The bugbear has hit you. You are wounded. Owie! I don't want to stand next to the bugbear anymore. I'm gonna scuttle out of there. So I take the retreat reaction, incurring a penalty to my actions on my next turn. But because you took the retreat reaction, that bugbear can't then make opportunity attacks for you because that is covered under that retreat reaction. It's a little bit complex. It'll definitely take some getting used to for tables that are more used to Pathfinder or 5e, but I do like it. I think it's a good mechanic to have. I think it makes sense. You get hit by a bugbear, you're not happy, you want to leave? Fair. You can leave. And the third reaction is Counterspell. Oh yes, the thing some of you are probably scared about. Counterspell is no longer a third-level spell, only acquirable, there we go, by a set amount of characters. Counterspell is something that everyone has now. Counterspell, the fighters have it, the clerics have it, the rogues have it. No longer is it shackled by means of wizardry. No, everyone can counterspell, including all of the enemies. Villainous silliness aside, the fun thing about this system is that it assumes that all creatures have some degree of magic, or at least some degree of connection to magic. It also assumes that they can use that magic to disrupt the magic of others. That's why your fighter can counterspell, that's why your rogue can counterspell, so on and so forth, right? Counterspelling is not something you do for free. It's not something that consumes your spell slot, but it does consume a resource. What's that cool resource we have? Well, we have the stamina resource, and we also have the mana resource. In this case, Counterspell consumes the mana resource. Effectively, you spend your mana in an attempt to counter their spell. What happens is when they cast their spell, they consume an amount of mana. They mark that off, that it was consumed by the casting of that spell. If you guess that amount, if you sacrifice an amount of mana equal to or exceeding that amount, that spell fizzles. If it's equal to it, it doesn't quite fizzle. There's a contested check. In this case, there we go. It's a contested willpower check. So you do kind of have a little bit of that wizard duel element in there. But otherwise, if you're just like, I think that's a fairly weak spell, but I don't want it going off right now, I'm going to sacrifice a comparatively small amount of mana because I'm pretty sure that that's going to be enough to block it. And maybe the DM says, no, your counterspell did not succeed. Regardless of whether or not it succeeds, you marked that mana off. You don't get that back if you fail. If you were equal to it, there's the contested check, and if you exceeded it, it just fizzles. Their spell just fizzles. It's just that simple. You can't group your mana together as a team to counter a spell. The wording is very particular there. I've also talked to the fellow on Discord, I assume it was one of the Chris's, about how the counterspell works, because the wording, by default, anyways, wasn't very clear. How it works is, instead of you pooling resources to counterspell it, you each can attempt to counterspell it. That is the intention. But you can't counterspell it all at once. You counterspell it one at a time. It is rules as intended that you not have to declare the amount you are spending ahead of time, just that you declare the intent to counterspell it. So let's say player 1 declares that he's going to counterspell it and spend 5 mana. The DM could say, 5 is not enough, you do not counterspell it. Player 2 can then say, I'm going to counterspell it. I spend 6 mana. The DM could say, okay, that is equal to it, roll a contested willpower check. Let's say that player fails. Then player 3 can step up and say, I counterspell using 7 mana. Because they know that 6 was equal to it because of that check, 7 mana will automatically succeed. They know that they overbid the spell cost by 1. That sort of metagaming is intended. And I don't think that metagaming is always bad. I'm 100% in agreement here with the rules designer. Would that be the term for it? With whichever Chris is responsible for it. The Chris with the last name that starts with C. Anyways, we're on the same page here. The party is still marking off a resource. The person that guessed at 5 still lost 5 mana. The person that guessed at 6 still lost 6 mana. Yes, the person at 7 was then able to guess accurately and into the spell, and they of course have to mark off 7 mana, which does mean that, like, depending on how big the party is, they can just infinitely guess, but that is still a mana cost. They might not have that mana to spend, or they might not have, they might run out of characters to guess it, especially if they're only guessing one number at a time. So a strategy within a party could be to guess at 2 at a time, right? Or more. It really just depends. To me, it's an interesting problem that, yes, it's a meta problem. It's an out of character problem of guessing the numbers, right? It's a guess the number game. By process of elimination, using your buddies. That being said, it is still a collaborative experience. The person that failed at 5 paved the way for the person at 6 to possibly have succeeded. And even though they failed, that paved the way for the person at 7 to then succeed. So it does feel as though, even though you failed, it was a collaborative effort. I could see people like, a nice fun mental image of somebody like thrusting out their hand to try and disrupt the spell, and and another guy's thrusts out their hand, and it's not quite enough. And then their buddy's like, okay, I got this, and thrusts out their hands, and now it succeeds, right? To me, it's fun, it's evocative, it's flavorful. I really like it. If you think that isn't balanced, that's not something you want to allow at your table, again, I talked to them on Discord. It is their intention that just because their rules as intended is to allow this kind of metagaming minigame, that doesn't have to be how it's run at your table. It is 100% valid to say, hey, I am casting a spell. Which of you want to counterspell it? And you collect those names. And then you say, okay, what amounts do you want to spend? And in what order? And then the players, they might still do the same, right? They might say 5, 6, and 7. Right? But in this case, that metagame knowledge might not be enough. Let's say the spell cost 8. That means all 3 of them just automatically fail. No hints, no nothing about it. Right? So you certainly can adopt that more brutal ruling, but that's how counterspelling works, is that basically everyone can try and counterspell it. My one concern is the DM counterspelling the players. That can still feel bad to be told, no, you don't get to do that. However, I think it's fine so long as the players keep in mind that enemy still spent a significant amount of mana to do that. The DM obviously has the meta knowledge to overcut it by 1 or be equal to it. Depending on your table, the DM may want to consistently be equal to it so that the dice get rolled, and so there's always an element of chance to it that might make it feel more fair. It's also an excuse to roll more dice, which is always fun. That's personally what I would recommend, right? Is as a DM, sit your players down and say, hey, I know that when it comes to the counterspell mechanic, I technically have an advantage, but A, my mana resources are finite, so even when I do successfully counterspell you, that still was significant for me. And then B, it's an opportunity for us to roll more dice. So there you go. That should just be part of the session 0, setting expectations. I know that people don't like counterspell on 5e. I think it being baked into the core rules here and being heavily involved with the mana stat makes it more pleasurable and much more viable, right? I don't foresee this being a problem. It's a bit crunchy. That's why I'm spending a long time talking about it right now. Sorry for that. But I don't see counterspell as a problem. It's definitely something that I would allow at my table. All right, that nitty-gritty nonsense aside, let's talk about spells, right? We're already talking about spells. Let's talk about spells. Upcasting is a thing. It's just as simple as if your spell says that you spend an amount of mana plus stuff, and if in the description it says what that effect is and what those increments are, bada bing, bada boom, you can upcast it. So the example given is activation cost 2 plus amount of mana. And then for each, let's say that amount of mana is 3, right? Let's say for each 3 mana, you can up the damage die by 1. I don't know. That sounds like a very weak effect to me. It's just an example. I'm just spitballing. I don't know how this is exactly balanced yet. But it gets the point across, right? You're just like, oh, okay, so I could spend 2 mana to do, let's say, 1d6. Or I could spend 5 mana to do 2d6. There you go. That'd be an example. I don't know if that's balanced or not, but that's how upcasting works. As you can see here, mana is your big resource, not spell slots anymore. While they both use the same term, upcasting, obviously this works differently. Another fun thing that we can do with this mana system is sustaining costs. Now some spells could be more powerful potentially, but require an additional cost at the top of your turn to be paid. That's what the sustaining cost is for. The example they give is enchanting a sword with burning fire during battle. In order to maintain that fire spell on that sword, you need to, not on your upkeep, I'm thinking about magic now, goodness. During your recovery step, you would then mark off whatever mana was required to keep that burning sword active. That's how sustaining costs work. I'm sure that stuff can vary wildly. They also use aura as an example, but sustaining cost is the keyword we're looking for here. And it's just as simple as recovery phase. Is there anything that needs to get marked off? Well, there you go. It gets marked off. Let's say you don't have enough points, though, and let's say you're sustaining more than one thing. You then choose in which order those 2 things deactivate. If you can only cover the cost of one or the other, you then choose which one you cover. It doesn't go, we don't track the order of when these effects went up. Remember, these could also not be spell effects. These could be tied to stamina. These could be abilities as well. But at the very least, your sustaining cost, you do have some choice. These also do happen at the end of the recovery step, not the beginning. So you get your points back, and then if you still don't have enough points, well, then that's that, I guess. But ideally, your recovery step and the points you get back helps to cover that cost, so it doesn't seem like it's going to be too hard to keep things up, unless we get into like some extreme examples. But otherwise, sustaining is I think fairly simple, and I like it. It's a fun mechanic we can play around and design around in terms of allowing our characters to have more powerful concentration type spells. Speaking of concentration, if they suffer an affliction, we'll get into afflictions in just a second, but think of them as like a severe wound, right? If they suffer an affliction while sustaining an effect, again, that could be a spell or maybe some kind of stamina type ability, they need to make a fortitude check. A con save, basically. The difficulty being 8 plus the total number of afflictions they now have. Ideally, that stays at a small, manageable number, but right now it's 9. If they had 0 afflictions, they're taking their first affliction. 8 plus 1 is 9. So then they make a fort check, trying to beat a 9. Let's say they roll a cumulative 11. They've succeeded. They are now continuing to sustain that effect. I do want to specify here that unlike them potentially being dropped at the beginning of the recovery step, if you are sustaining 2 things, whichever thing costs the most when that concentration is interrupted by the affliction, whatever is costing the most to maintain, that's what gets dropped. Not both, just the highest. So let's say that you are sustaining 4 things, right? One of them costs 4, 2 of them cost 3, 1 of them costs 1. If you were to take an affliction, you make your fort check, let's say you fail, the one that cost 4 gets dropped. Let's say that happens again on the next turn. One of the ones that costs 3 gets dropped. You do get to choose if it's a tie. And then, of course, let's say 2 more afflictions happen, then the other 3 would drop, and then the 1 would finally drop. So it's a little bit of a complicated mechanism, but overall I like it. I think that 3 or more sessions into a campaign, you'll be used to it. I don't think it will be that big of a deal. But it is a little bit of crunchiness, right? So far, I've been praising the system for being very simple. A few concessions. Counterspelling is crunchy. Sustaining is crunchy. The damage types and afflictions and whatnot, which I'll get to later, is a very crunchy system. And then first aid is a little bit crunchy. And what is it? Channeling. There we go. Channeling is very crunchy. So there are like a few moments that are very crunchy. That being said, in each case, they enable the player to make certain choices that I think are intriguing. They're very much stuff that the players can control, and they often involve elements of risk and reward that I like the kind of direction they're going in terms of player agency. Beyond just player agency of playing your character, you also have agency over the decisions you make, what risks you take. Do you decide to use one of your actions to reduce some of the damage in one of your damage category, thus moving you further away from a threshold where a bad thing happens? Or do you use that action to attack, right? Do you use that resource do you channel? Well, I'll get into channeling in just a moment. I'm sorry. Let's stay on focus here. We were covering spellcasting. Let's continue with that. We do still have our 3 components. You have your verbal component, your somatic component, and your material component. No. Your focus. Your arcane focus or holy symbol or whatever is now baked into the system. You no longer require, a material component that can then be circumvented by a focus. It's just focuses now. Because focus is a thing that got tweaked, I'm going to cover that first. This item, regardless of what it is, wand, charm, holy symbol, whatever, is something that the caster has painstakingly attuned to their body, mind, and power, is the language they use here. So you are attuned to this item. This item is very important to you. You have psychically imprinted upon it in some way. I mean, that's my flavor, but at the very least, this is tied to you, perhaps to your very soul. When that item gets taken from you or destroyed, you can attune to a new focus. It does mean that your spellcasting options will be limited for a time, so that's still a fun way where the DM could challenge you by having there be like some kind of powerful character snatch away your focus or break it, or a thief in the night steal your focus, or if you're in jail, well, you don't have a focus now. Ooh. Regardless of how your DM chooses to bully you, attuning to your new focus requires a week per character level. It's a pretty simple ruling, right? In the case of like you being thrown in jail, though, that does beg to the question: could you find like a brick or a stone or something from jail? It's just a normal, ordinary object that's just really, really silly, and be like, you know what? This is my brick. This is my sacred brick. I'm going to coddle this brick for 3 weeks, and then I can escape from jail. I don't know. I don't know if you have to coddle or not, but it's just at the flavor, the image that could be a scene that's set up, right? The DM has thrown you in jail. You don't have your beloved wand, but I have my new beloved brick. I think it's funny. Quickly covering the other 2. Verbal works the same. So long as you can speak, you can meet what you need to be able to do that. You say simsalabim or whatever, and the spell happens, right? Somatic is still the same thing, where you do your fun hand motions, a gesture, you point, I don't know, whatever it is you want to flavor that. It's still the same. So long as you have that open hand, you're good to go. I want to double check. Can your focus hand count as your open hand? Because I know that was a thing from 5e. Give me just a moment. Hey there, Derek from the future here to tell you that we still don't know. I mean, we kind of know. Here's what he said. It seems though the intention is that, like, so long as you have the proper limb available, you're good to go. But that the jury's still out, and there might be some specific restraining ways that could stop a caster and maybe not stop the caster. It depends on knowledge. There could be a lot of fringe edge cases. For right now, I'm of the opinion that it's largely the Wild West. You can rule it however you want. Moving on to something else that is associated with spellcasting, Ether. You have one of two options. By default, it's determined by your species, but there's optional rules I'll talk about in just a moment. Flow gives you a benefit and a risk. Reservoir gives you a benefit and a risk. If you come into contact with an anti-mage, sorry, not an anti-mage, with an end mage who has a anti-magic field around them, effectively, that risk comes into play. You can get really effed. Those effects are not meant to be super common, is my understanding. So this is definitely a rule that won't come up very often, but it is an option there for the DM to challenge the players, especially if it's a mage-heavy party. Then perhaps that's a way to let the warrior shine, is that the mages all stepped inside this anti-magic field. It triggered a trap. Some automatons have disconnected from the walls and are now coming towards the party. It's up to that fighter in the party to fend them off, as well as what few stamina-related things the other players can flex to hopefully come out on top, right? It could create a very interesting encounter or challenge, but otherwise it seems as though Ether and its flow and reservoir mechanics probably won't come all that up, dynamically at least. Now, passively, if you are a species that has flow, not reservoir, flow, you get a +1 bonus to your mana regeneration. Nice and simple, just a fun passive +1. If you are reservoir, you get a +1 to your mana capacity. Additionally, when you do enter that anti-magic field, your regeneration drops to 0. With flow, if you were to enter that field, both regeneration and your pool drop to 0. So reservoir keeps their pool. They keep their magic. They don't get immediately effed, right? They still could cast magic. The risk then for that is that if they do cast all the way down to 0 mana while they're under that anti-magic effect, they immediately suffer the mana shock affliction. Affliction's another keyword we're going to get to later, but very important. And they gain the sapped condition for a d4 rounds. Oh, sorry, the sapped condition comes on board once they leave the area of effect. Okay. So they'll still suffer that affliction, but then when they finally leave that anti-magic effect, they still are effed for upwards of 4 rounds. The flow mage, on the other hand, is immediately effed. All their stuff tanks to 0. Hold on. There we go. And then when they leave the area of effect, when the anti-magic effect is gone, they gain the sapped condition for 1 round. Just 1 round, not a dice roll, just 1 round, and they also don't have to have that risk of that extra mana shock affliction. So, flow is just like anti-magic comes on board, you're immediately effed, but past that point, it's not so bad. Reservoir is like, okay, you know what, my regen's gone, and when I leave, I'm gonna be a little bit effed. But for right now, I can still cast some spells. I just need to be careful not to hit 0. So it creates this nice risk-reward sort of situation, right? Do you want to cast spells? Do you want to use your abilities that consume mana? Risking that maybe you go a little bit too far and you go to 0 and you do suffer this nonsense? Or do you want to try and be like, okay, I'm just going to conserve that. I'm not gonna deal with that. We're going to be fine, right? Depends on the scenario, but it's definitely a mechanic that DMs could use in interesting ways to challenge their players. Me personally, I think it's rather harsh, and I don't see myself or most DMs using it on a consistent basis. Every now and then for like a boss fight or for like a cool trap or scene, absolutely fine. But unless like that is the theme of your dungeon, this is an anti-wizard tower, that sort of thing, I don't see it being a frequent thing. And from what I can tell, talking to them on Discord, they don't seem to think it is a frequent thing either. They do want to make the End Mage class and End Mage effects and abilities and whatnot, and then they say that it's going to be a very high risk, high reward type of a class. I'm intrigued by that and excited to see how that works, but at the same time, I'm not sure how ready I would be to let my players play it. It seems like it would mess with a lot of the different mechanics in the game, including like drinking potions and whatnot. So it's a cool feature, but also like put Ether at the back of your mind. All that super matters for the majority of the campaign is that Flow gives you +1 to regen, Reservoir gives you +1 to capacity. You can simplify it to that, and for 95% of the game, let's say, that's all you really need, right? The DM doesn't necessarily have to evoke that fun anti-magic rule, but I do like the anti-magic rule overall. I just don't, whatever. I'm rambling now. I'm going to move on. I'm now going to skip over a few little categories over to damage conditions and afflictions, because I think that this is important, and then I'll go back to cover those like little small details. To me, this is both like the area of the game that is most unique and fascinating, but also potentially scares me. Here's what I mean. You have these two sheets. Ideally, I'm putting them on screen right now. You can see there's a lot of fun little bubbles on them. Some of them have a little bold circle around them. Some of them are filled in. Some of them have all sorts of fun symbols. All of them have a skull at the very end. Basically, whenever you take any damage, the DM will hopefully tell you the damage type. I mean, they should. And then you increment along there. So let's say you took 5 slashing damage one turn. The next turn you take 3. Now you're at 8 slashing damage, and so on. You just keep tracking it and going down that chart. There's also a little star symbol. That's also important. Anyways, if you were to get to that little skull in any of these little damage systems, you die. You'll also notice that while a lot of the physical ones have a lengthier chart, a lot of the rare damage types, or magical damage types, like Burning or Ardent, have very stout charts. If you start taking damage of those types, you will approach death a lot faster than if you were taking damage of those other types. So do look out for those more supernatural special damage types. I'll resume going over what all the funny symbols mean and all the fun other ways to die and what afflictions are in just a moment. I do want to briefly cover the biggest problem I have with this, if you fellas working on this game are listening, is that it makes it, I would say, near impossible for the DM to track this on their side. Maybe that's the norm, and then maybe that's supposed to be considered the norm. But it requires you to both trust the players and then also trust the players to not make mistakes. If they're tracking it with beads and the table gets nudged, well, now they don't know their damage anymore. If they're tracking it with pencils and they're erasing it constantly, well, now maybe they have to print out a new piece of paper. If you're tracking it digitally, that's probably the best way to do it. But also that requires people to make software that supports that, or people to go and make their own little Excel spreadsheets, that sort of thing. There's definitely like pros and cons to the players tracking it. It does mean the DM has less to keep track of and less to deal with. Yes. And it being a necessity that the players track it, does mean that the DM is forced to take a less active role there. Whereas in some systems, the DM is tempted to take a more active role there. The downside is that the DM is not privy to that information. In other words, the DM no longer knows when to hold back. I'm not just talking about fudging dice rolls. There's also more subtler ways where they're just like, ooh, okay, John over there is getting very close to this slashing death tier on the slashing death damage chart. I'm going to make an excuse in character to go after James's character instead, right? Therefore, you are still being optimal and still playing that villain. That villain is still doing damage, but you're avoiding killing John's character, right? But if you don't know how close John is to death on that slashing chart, because you don't have it in front of you, you don't have a way to look at it. Pardon me. Because you don't have a way to look at it without asking John, then that becomes a bit of a problem, because you don't know when to hold back, when to either fudge the dice or when to potentially redirect damage. It does make the system... it does make the system a lot more deadly, which might be the intention. There is some language in here that does preach to me that is the intention. And me personally, I'm all for it. I believe that players should be allowed to make mistakes. I believe players should be allowed to die. I believe that adventuring has risks. It is not a easy career, right? That the players can get in over their head, and there are times where you do need to run away. I'm all for that kind of rough and tumble table. That's my table, personally. That being said, I recognize that that's not everyone's table. And taking away the ability to fudge as a DM from certain tables means that people are going to die more often, and that might not be something that table is comfortable with. We might just be brutal and say, well, tough cookies, this just isn't the system for you. I don't know. If not, this might be something that needs to be addressed. As weird as this sounds, you might want to request that people use a set app, or perhaps develop a Google Doc that is an Excel spreadsheet. Because the problem with that is that it would then require each player to bring a computer. So if it's pen and paper, they'd all have to have their laptop and then be marking their damage. And then even though the DM could go and look at all those individual charts, they still needed a way to input that information. So you'd have a bunch of laptops at the table, which might not be the best. You could potentially come up with some kind of phone app. That would cost money to develop, or at the very least, if you have someone that's willing to do it for free, then it would certainly cost time and goodwill. But that could be a way around that. If we're not doing it digitally, though, if this is a pen and paper game, again, we do have that issue where this is going to be by necessity a more deadly system, because the DM won't have the information they need to keep their players alive. Again, that could be okay, but it's a concern of mine. Hopefully that was of value. And not just to the developers either, a value to you, the person that would be running this game and playing at this game. Like this is me effectively also saying, DM to player, hey, depending on how we're running this and how easy it is how easy it is for me, there we go, to reference these charts, depending on that, I may not be able to hold back. I may kill you more often than I would in another system. Death is a part of this game. Death is okay. I am going to jump ahead a little bit. The resting mechanics actually encourage you to make multiple characters. Some mechanics, like the Afflictions, can't be healed by just a normal long rest. You do need to take downtime. You do need to take weeks to try and heal off those Afflictions. If not, those Afflictions start stacking up very fast and you die. So while those Afflictions are healing off on your primary character, it then encourages you to make another character. Perhaps a mercenary. The party meets at the tavern. They recognize that Bob the Barbarian needs a couple weeks off, but they still need to get in that dungeon and clear it off before the goblins come back home. This is a time-sensitive mission. We need to hire some kind of mercenary that can fit Bob's role, and that's when you bring in your second character, right? And then they go with the party in the dungeon. And now, let's say next adventure, Bob's back. He's back from his little vacation, his little hiatus. Let's say Bob dies. Grim, I know, but let's say Bob dies. Now the party can be like, well, we did have that cool mercenary guy from a while back. And they say, hey, Mr. Mercenary, how do you feel about being on the team on a more permanent basis? We'll give you a equal cut of the pay. We will treat you like one of our very own here. You are no longer a hiree. You are a part of our adventuring company. How does that sound? And then that mercenary character can say, that sounds swell. And then, of course, if we're taking this out of character, what happened was that player had a character, they sidelined that character, brought in a new character, took away that new character, brought back in the old character died, and now they're bringing in a backup character that already existed, that already had ties to the party. It's a comforting thought to know that, yes, Bob dies, and that stings, right? You lost a character. Depending on who you are as a player, that's going to sting to varying degrees. For me, I'm more than okay with my characters dying. I don't care. I'll enjoy them while I have them. I'm not going to be suicidal, but it's not something that I really worry too much about. I'm more than okay with my characters dying. But for some players, that's not them. They very much care about their characters, and they expect them to go from level 1 to level 20 or whatever the system uses. And they expect them to have an arc and not die young and not die early or not die before that arc is done. In this particular case, if that character does die early, so to speak, they at least have a backup character that may have already been involved in the story and is very easy to fit back into it. For that reason, I love this system. Like this is a fantastic system. I'll gush more about it later when I get to that section. But like just the way the mechanics teach the DM how to run good campaigns by necessity, just by following the rules, to me is brilliant, because we don't have tools like that in 5e that teach 5e DMs how to run their games effectively, how to honor death. And this game has honoring death and making that sting of death hurt less baked right into the core, and it makes me so happy. Alrighty, speaking of death, let's get back on track now. What are all these fun ways you can die? Well, each of these damage types have different ways you can die. A lot of them have a dark ring at them. You can see that for slashing, there's one at 5, 10, and 14. If we go over to burning, there's one at 5, 9, and 10, right? Each time you were to get to that dark ring, it triggers the condition for that damage type. So let's go over to slashing. We go beneath it on this little chart, and it says bleeding. So whenever you got to that increment of damage at 5, bleeding triggered. Whenever you got to it at 10, bleeding triggered. Whenever you got to it at 14, bleeding triggered. Let's say you had 0 slashing damage, and then a big baddie dealt 14 damage to you. That means not only do you take 14 damage and you go unmarked that, but also bleeding has triggered 3 times. So at the start of your turn, you take 3 slashing damage is what that then means. Okay, so bleeding's one that naturally stacks anyway, so that's not a good example. I know there's some things that do go away. I'm going to go over to Infernal. I think, Curse is one of those things. So if we go to Infernal, they get their curse condition with their Dark Circle at increment 1, increment 5, and increment 9. So let's say that the baddie dealt 9 or more damage to you in one hit. You are now cursed thrice over. Whenever you roll a d12, roll twice and take the lower results. It is effectively disadvantage. Cursed is this game's version of disadvantage, and I can't find disadvantage anywhere else in it. Normally, if in areas where disadvantage would be, they actually de-increment the die. So instead of it being a d12, it's a d10, which to me means you can no longer crit. That's not insignificant, but it's also still not disadvantage. But curse is effectively a disadvantage effect. You'll see that the Dark Circle under Infernal says gain 1 round of curse. So effectively, you've now gained 3 rounds of curse by taking that 9 damage. Let's say that instead you took it in small steps. You took 3 damage in curse, and then 2 rounds later, you took another 5 damage of curse, and then another 2 rounds later, you took another small amount of curse, which brought you up to 9. Well, then you were only cursed that first turn, so then you had your second turn that you were fine and you weren't cursed, and then you took that damage again, and so now you're cursed again for a turn, but then you also had that turn where you were fine after that, because it was just for 1 round, and then you reached that 9 threshold, okay, you're cursed again for another round, right? Effectively, the way cursed works here is that because it didn't happen all at once, you don't have to worry about it round and round and round and round. It's incremental. It's just 1 round at a time. It's I don't know. It's not simple. This is the area where things are crunchy. But it's definitely doable, right? You can hopefully understand it by looking at the chart. I think that it's readable enough. You can see that the Dark Circle says gain 1 round of curse. You go right down below it. It says curse. It says what it does. It says it does advantage. If you are printing these things out and using them with pen and paper, there's even a section where you can say rounds left of curse, which again, might just be one at a time. And so maybe you just mark one and erase one, and then mark one and then erase one. I don't know. That sounds tedious to me, and like you're gonna scratch up your paper pretty quick. But maybe that's how you want to track it. I don't know. Or maybe you just do it in your head. I think that's reasonable. Anyway, infernal damage is one of those damage types that doesn't really stack. Bleeding is a damage type that clearly does stack, if we go back to our example. And then same for burning. We can see gain 1 ignite counter. So in our example, we'd taken 15 burning damage. So we'd be at 3 ignite counters. And then we go and see how that scales off from the igniting effect. You can see that under a lot of these, there is treatment. That I think all of them, or at least most of them, I think it's all of them though, require an action to try and like lessen that, which can be very important because depending on the effect, those effects can kind of go into a bit of a death spiral. So you may need to take the time, either for yourself or an ally taking the time for you to get you out of that death spiral. Here's where I will bring back up the aid action. What's it called? I know it's not just aid. There we go. The first aid action. And why I said it was very important. Because of these different damage thresholds, let's say you were at 8 slashing damage, but only 1 burning damage. You are now 2 away from that 10 circle in slashing. That's a significant increase in damage per round. That bleeding effect is not good. So you could choose to remove that 1 burning damage with the first aid action, or because slashing is really close to that next increment, and maybe you're trying to avoid that, you could spend your first aid curing some of that slashing damage and bringing that down a little bit. And then ideally you then would take, let's say, 4 slashing damage. And you're like, okay, cool. Because I aided myself last turn, I thought ahead, I made good decisions, I am no longer at bleeding 2, I am still at bleeding 1. That's an example of where aid can be super clutch, and why I think that Ent, for some people, they might still be tempted to dump it. I think that being able to aid characters and keep them out of very extreme threshold circumstances can be very important. For example, we can see that at slashing 15, at 14 right below it, you can see that there's a dark circle, right? So let's say they're at slashing 13. They're about to cross a threshold into not only the circle at 14, but the star at 15. And the star is not good. We haven't covered the star yet. You want the star does? The star means you get an affliction. There's no save against it. You just get an affliction. You get to roll on a fancy table for a fun debuff. Then some of those debuffs, again, activate a bit of a death spiral. You don't want afflictions. You want 0 afflictions. And once you get afflictions, it's very hard to remove them because you need to take that extended downtime, right? You need to take a week of rest for each affliction you want to remove. Or maybe it's tied to a die. I'll double check in just a moment. But afflictions are a good way to go towards a death spiral. It's the main reason why I would recommend you take downtime. But again, in our example, they are 2 points away from crossing 2 very bad thresholds. But let's say you've got a high intelligence character that comes over here and does their first aid on them. And now that threshold's moved back to, like, let's say 9 slashing. Okay, cool. Now they're, what would that be? Now they are 6 away from crossing those 2 thresholds, right? And then to round out the rest of the chart, the sleeping face means they're incapacitated. We'll go over that in just a moment. And then, of course, the skull means death. I think I already covered that. You'll see that under explosive, there are a bunch of other little fun symbols. Those are detailed below. Same for Ardent and Infernal, and let me see, a few of the other ones. Yeah. Eldritch and Ether. They all have a filled-in circle that gains a fun additional little effect. For Infernal, they gain the Doomed Affliction, which is not only bad because it's an additional affliction gain that then contributes to that death spiral, but it also is a nasty debuff. I don't remember what it is. I think it's something along the lines of basically taking double damage. But yes, it's something that will kill you very quickly. If you are doomed, you are indeed doomed. This is something that you do need to address as soon as possible. So I would imagine that if it doesn't already exist in the playtest material, having a caster that can treat afflictions, maybe just a set number of uses per day or something like that, some sort of limiting factor, because just being able to cure all your afflictions for free would be busted, right? But maybe having something that can, like, I don't know, cast like a lesser restoration type of a spell to get rid of key afflictions like Doomed, that would be very powerful. So I don't know, maybe you don't want to make spells that are that powerful, maybe you do, but if those sort of affliction healing options aren't available to the party, if you get certain afflictions that are very bad like Doomed, go back to town, take a nap, take another nap, wait the rest of the week, get rid of that Doomed affliction, because I should double check that. Yeah, I was right. Doomed reads, when you suffer damage, take an additional point of that same type. Yes, double damage. Yeah, because if you are doomed, if you are taking double damage, you are going to quickly approach those fun skull symbols on all your fun little charts here. Alright, so we've gone over these fun charts, how they have their various little status effects, each tailored to the damage type, how those trigger, where those trigger, how the stars will go and trigger afflictions. Let's go into those afflictions a little bit more. You have your fun little affliction chart. When you roll on that affliction chart, you roll a d8 and you add the number of afflictions to it. Here's where things can kind of reach that death spiral again. If, of course, you have, let's say, 10 afflictions and you roll an 8, now you're in that upper tier. 18 is unconsciousness. Gain the incapacitated condition below. Incapacitated means that you're basically dead if something taps you. It's not good. You don't want to be incapacitated in this game. I mean, you don't want to be incapacitated in most games, but you get what I mean. You can see how having more afflictions can lead to death a lot more quickly. It would also allow them to potentially weight the table, so to speak. Basically have like the less like debilitating afflictions at those lower numbers. And of course having those more major afflictions at those higher numbers as your wounds more or less accumulate and result in worse and worse wounds. I haven't fully read the table. I don't know if the table is weighted, but if it's not weighted, that's definitely something that I think they should do. I think that's an opportunity design-wise that I certainly would take advantage of. Regardless of whether or not the table is weighted, you have stuff like suffering a minus 1d4 penalty to hit, just on all of them, right? You are now anywhere between 1 and 4 less likely to hit. And since the die system is a lot lower with a d12, that is pretty significant. Armor compromised, minor. Your armor class reduced by 1. That also seems pretty significant. Speed reduced by 5 feet. That's probably not too significant. So some of these are probably not that bad. Some of these are probably just fine. But you can see how like these sort of minor issues can certainly add up over time. And since your current number of afflictions is going to be rising constantly, not only does this affect you getting closer to rolling a 20 or above, resulting in the death of your character, but that affliction counter, I believe, is also called upon during some of your fortitude checks. There might be other miscellaneous effects that call towards the number of afflictions you have. I don't remember exactly how often it's referenced, but there are significant mechanics that do reference the number of afflictions. For the sake of keeping this video somewhat brief, I've decided not to cover all the afflictions and all the special afflictions and the fate point table in detail, nor like all the little status effects under damage. There's a lot there. I can trust that the players will be able to like skim that on their own. DMs will be able to skim that on their own, or as these things become relevant, you can simply look it up, right? But for right now, I'm just going to move on. And by move on, I mean move back, because I just realized that I didn't actually cover the mechanics of first aid. I only covered its importance and the fact that it was tied to, was it knowledge? Yeah, it was knowledge. Okay. First aid. You attempt to heal yourself or another creature you can touch. Remove a number of points of damage equal to half your knowledge score. All removed points must be of the same damage type. The creature may, at maximum, have healed half of the current damage it has for that damage type each round. This is, again, what I was talking about before, one of those more crunchy areas, because you have to, like, keep track of how much they've been healed per round, whether or not that meets the half of the current damage of that type per round. That's a crunchy thing to keep track of, on top of doing math, of taking your knowledge and dividing it in half, and then figuring out whether or not you round up or down. I've just realized it doesn't say if you round up or down on first aid. I guess for right now, that's up to the DM. I have asked on Discord if they do have a ruling there. I'll put in the video if they get back to me fast enough. I did get an answer about whether or not to round up or down. When you have the knowledge to calculate your healing, you do round down. It seems as though if this crops up again, rounding down is the general rule of thumb for this system at this point in time, but it seems as though that could change by the time a proper official, quote-unquote, release would happen. But for right now, the default is round down. I imagine you could probably house rule round up. Again, it looks like we're still testing to see which is more appropriate. First aid is a bit crunchy, but it's doable. And I think that it might be necessary to keep your friends out of those thresholds. I assume that healing magic exists as well. I assume there'll be alternative methods of healing. But I think it's interesting that beyond just magical healing, the one stat tied to non-magical healing is knowledge, is basically the intelligence stat. Not only does it buff the intelligence stat, but it also gives the wizard type character the ability to heal and come in clutch. It's also very nice because it kind of embodies the idea of medicinal knowledge, right? Of like science and progress, that they know how to properly patch up a wound. They know how to use a splint, right? They know how to set that bone, right? That it is a knowledge, is effectively modern medical knowledge, or not necessarily modern because it's fantasy setting, but some degree of medical knowledge that is allowing them to properly address this wound. I think that that's great flavor. It makes sense, and it's a very good way to buff intelligence, and it meshes very well with the sort of damage oriented combat calculator that they use in this system. We will have to wait and see if I get proven right or wrong in my assessment that knowledge is very important, and that it will first aid will come in clutch in avoiding those damage thresholds. But I'm pretty sure that will come in clutch, or at the very least, as an intelligence character, that's definitely something I would consider. Is I would constantly like poking my nose over at other people's damage charts and trying to see how close they are to some next threshold. Or if I was a character and I was close to a threshold, I'd be poking my way over to the other player and saying, "Hey, do any of you have a spare action next turn? Can one of you heal me? I'm about to cross this really bad threshold and slashing damage. I'd really rather not do that. If you could help me out on your next turn, I'd really appreciate it." Right? It allows for every single character at the table, because it's baked into the core actions, to have the ability to do that teamwork and to be able to have each other's back. Basically, every character is a support character, or at least has the capacity to be a support character to some degree, and I very much like that. Oh, also, one more quick little thing for trivia. Ardent, I'm pretty sure, in this game would be a representation of light magic. Possibly the laser gun damage type. I guess it depends on it. Maybe hard light as well, because I know that they're wanting to make this compatible with their sci-fi setting. But the use of the word ardent here, based off from the definition of the word, or at least the second definition of the word. There we go. I believe that ardent effectively means light magic, and it causes the blinded effect. So I mean, yeah, it's light magic. In case you were confused by that word, because it's an uncommon, weird word, there you go. It's light magic. Ether, similarly, is kind of like a catch-all arcane type magic. It has to deal with like channeling energy within you or being drained, right? That's typically where it comes up. You can find the entry for sapped underneath ether. That's its debuff. So when we're talking before about the anti-magic field causing the sapped condition, this is it. It's here under ether. Speaking of ether, I can now go back in time and cover something else that I skipped. Channeling. Channeling is another time for crunchiness, so bear with me. It is a special action that all player characters and spellcasting creatures, except in mages and gnolls, can perform. So again, this is something that's pretty much available to everyone. I'm going to choose not to go into the details, but what it effectively does is it increases your recovery rate of your mana. So if you are channeling with your action, on your next turn during that recovery phase, you will get back more mana, right? You'll still get back mana no matter what, but if you had been channeling your next on your previous turn, you will get back an increased amount. And if you were to then on that turn channel again, effectively continue channeling, then instead of gaining back +1, let's say, you gain back +2, and so on and so forth. The amount that can increment to +1 to +2 and so on and so forth, the amount of additional little round bonuses you can accumulate is tied to your character's level. So a level 1 character can only ever channel like that base amount, right? Or not that base amount. They can only channel +1, right? So a two round cycle is their capacity. A level 3 character, they now have a 4-round cycle. A level 5 character, they now have a 6-round cycle. That is the benefit of channeling, is you just can constantly keep regaining more and more and more. So if you are a mage, something you could do is action 1, channel, action 2, cast a spell. And that just becomes your consistent turn, right? That kind of has its own sort of risk, though, the channeling mechanic. If you were at full mana, let's say, and you were channeling, right? Or near full mana and channeling. Let's say that your mana base, your mana capacity, there we go, is like 8. I don't know how feasible that is, but let's say it's at 8. Let's say that at the beginning of your recovery phase, you channeling would have caused it to go to, let's say, 10. That means that on your end step, if you are still at 10 out of 8 mana, you take 2 ether damage. That damage type that we just covered, that's magical and that can result in you being sapped, right? That's the risk you run. However, let's use that same example, right? Your capacity is 8, but you went up to 10. That increase up to 10 happened at the beginning of your turn, which means that you can still use your action to cast a spell. And if your spell then costs 2 or more mana, well, suddenly you're ending your turn at 8 or lower. And now you don't have to worry about that cost. So long as you do risk like overcharging yourself if you just keep channeling and whatnot and going above capacity. But so long as you also still have that other action to be casting your spells, you can kind of mitigate that cost. But if something stops you from casting, right? Let's say that you were... Yeah, okay, how about this? Let's say that you were approached by that bugbear, right? And that bugbear hurt you, and you didn't like that. So you took that fun little reaction where you step away and it costs you an action. Well, now you only have 1 action on that turn, and you have to choose, do I maintain that channel thing, knowing that, in future turns I'm going to be able to get more and more back, or do I drop it, right? Because I don't want to over-channel. Because you know that you're not going to be able to channel and cast a spell on that turn, because you only have that 1 action. So you can't mitigate that mana burn, effectively, from being above max capacity. But do you want to take that mana burn anyways to keep your channel going? Your channeling stacks increasing? Or do you just not channel on that turn, your stack gets reset, but you don't have to deal with that damage, right? It's a fun little risk-reward type of mechanic that I very much like. There's definitely some characters that will never channel at all, right? There's some characters that it will just never come up for. But for certain types of spellcasters and certain types of players that have their abilities that rely on mana or spells, right? it's definitely an interesting mechanic to play around with. Because if you're not moving, then you don't have to take the move action. You could just sit there and like blast and channel and stay at like those high numbers so that when the enemy mage casts like a big spell, you're just like, this is why I was staying close to my maximum, is because now I can cash in all those points on that counterspell, right? It's this interesting playstyle that I very much like. Again, there are moments of crunchiness here. First aid, very crunchy. Channel, very crunchy. The damage nonsense and the afflictions and whatnot and how that comes into everything, very crunchy. But you can see how at each of those steps, it works well with the system, and it provides the players with options. It provides them with choices, meaningful choices that could result in triumph or death. And to me, that is peak game design, right? You want your players to have agency. You want your players to feel as though they're in control, to feel as though they have choice, to feel as though they won because they played well. Sometimes they lose, right? Like that's it happens, right? And we've gone over that. So when they do die, it doesn't sting as much. But still, they have the choices that could lead to victory. And obviously, because it's a tabletop game, we want the players to win. As a DM, we're going to balance things in their favor. We're going to try and make sure they win, right? That's our role here. But when they do win, they're going to feel as though that was because of the choices they made. Because they made that cool clutch channeling play to take that extra damage, or they made that cool clutch first aid play to keep the paladin on his feet, because otherwise he would have taken that massive hit at 15 slashing, right? It enables the players to make those really cool clutch decisions that otherwise they wouldn't have been able to make if these mechanics weren't in there. Same with counterspelling, right? Just because like it costs the players a lot of mana to counter that spell, if that spell was really, really bad, that becomes suddenly a very clutch moment where it's just like, oh man, I'm glad that Jim counterspelled for 4 and tied, because then that let me counterspell for 5 and guarantee it, right? There's a lot of, I don't know. To some people, this is gonna seem bad, right? Maybe it's not your perfect system, but for me, I like it a lot. It's a little bit crunchy, but not to a degree that I'm uncomfortable with, right? Like it's still, and it's also simplified like a lot of other areas, right? Like skill proficiencies have been removed. Proficiencies have been removed, period. A lot of the other areas are much more simple, which then hopefully will free up headspace for what your character is capable of as informed by your classes, and their influence, I think is what the word is. And then B, it also frees up that headspace for, okay, do I want a careful attack or do I want a power attack? Do I want to use first aid? Do I channel? If I am channeling, do I keep channeling? How do I want to do this, right? I don't know. I really like it. I think that the flow of combat, both at low level play and high level play, is going to be very interesting to see how that interacts with the various creatures and monsters and whatnot that are being designed and developed. And I very much want to run this system, and I very much want to write for this system, regardless of whether or not it ends up being a success and catches on or not. This is an intriguing system that I am very passionate about. I apologize for being kind of all over the place when it comes to this section. It is what it is. But there is an additional way to die that I think is more likely than getting to the end of a damage route, and that is also more likely than getting to the end of the affliction chart. And that is via the fun little calculus next to the toughness stat. Depending on your class choices, and of course any like additional buffs and modifiers, you have a toughness score. Sorry, no, that's called the toughness rating. There we go. You have a toughness rating. In the example they use, the toughness rating is 9. The character's level is then added to that toughness rating for the first number. It is just the vanilla number for the second number, and for the third number, it is half of 9 plus half of the character level. So, in the example given here, we have Jasper, the level 5 spell sword, is what it looks like to me. He the first score comes to 14, the second score comes to 9, and the final score comes to 6. If we just read it across, it tells the rules plain and simple. I have to roll on the affliction table every 14 points of damage I take. If I have 9 afflictions at once, I am incapacitated. If I take 6 points of damage while incapacitated, I die. So that kind of shows you how being incapacitated pardon me, can quickly lead to death, right? 6 doesn't seem like that'd be all that hard for a monster to deal. So as soon as you go down, as soon as you're incapacitated, depending on how big that number is, that monster could just step on your head, make sure it's dead. That's the old adage, and now you're out of the game, bucko. Bucko. Anyway, beyond just other effects that make you incapacitated, if you have 9 afflictions at once, you get incapacitated. So that's also a thing. You don't have to necessarily go all the way to rolling a 20 on the affliction thing to die. It could just be as simple as, oops, I reached my threshold, I'm sleepy time, and now they killed me, right? So that's a very easy way to die. Those afflictions, of course, can accumulate very quickly by the top area where every 14 points of damage I take, I get a new affliction. So it's not just those star-shaped things on those damage charts. That's the primary way. You've also seen there's other ways to gain afflictions via special affliction rules, right? This adds yet another way to gain an affliction. Every 14 damage, boom, poor Jasper the mage has to take an affliction. It was at this point in time that I realized the wording on when damage heals was unclear, and then I went to Discord for a clarification. So here you go, on screen right now. The way it's worded in the core rules will be updated later, but the design and intention is that damage goes away as soon as combat drops. But the afflictions, those don't go away. Afflictions are still the main source of your death spiral. That stuff with the toughness chart was still absolutely relevant. You can still die from damage, but it seems that'll be very rare since you're wiping that slate clean constantly. Anyways, I then went on to cover this section on how the DM sets their checks and save DCs. That's not something that we really need to dive into here. That's for individual DMs to play around with. But then I briefly touched on AC, so we'll resume there. AC still exists. It's calculated different. That's in the character side of things, which we can cover somewhere else, or possibly not at all. We'll see how I'm feeling in the future. But basically, yes, there is still a number that you have to surmount or equal in order to hit. And then once you hit, you get to roll whatever damage that weapon says, right? Here's where we get back into the thrown weapon category. I did already let you know that goes based off from precision by default. Maybe there's some sort of exception rule, but by default it is precision. You can't throw a weapon at a target that's within melee reach. So effectively, if you're standing next to somebody, you can't chuck your weapon at them. There's no point. Just hit them with that weapon. Why are you trying to chuck it? You fool. That doesn't allow you to be foolish here in this game, at least as far as chucking weapons at people right next to you is concerned. As far as like ranged stuff goes, there's also a mechanic called Longshots. This includes making a long shot, using the long shot mechanic for thrown weapons as well. You can try and go beyond its default range. When you do so, you double that weapon's listed range, and you drop the attack die 2 sizes. And you can repeat that again and again, right? So let's say the bow has a range of 30 feet, right? 30 feet's not enough. We gotta double it. Now it's 60 feet, but the die to hit has dropped from a D12 to a D8. Alright, 60 is still not enough. Let's double it again. 120 feet. Now we're dropping from a D8 to a D4. Well, that's still not enough either. Let's double it again. We're dropping it to a 1. So they do now have a 320-foot range, but they don't get to roll a die. They just have 1 plus their precision. Maybe they can use one of their fate points to get a D8 on that attack. That might be a way to make those extreme long shots hit. But that's an example of how the long shot mechanic works, is that instead of incurring disadvantage after a certain range like 5e does it, you instead just start like incurring die penalties depending on how much further out you are trying to do your whole long shot type thing. We also get a default ruling for spell attacks. It is just like regular attacks. It's a d12, and you get to add your primary stat from the spell's class. There are exceptions, so we do need to look out for them. But by default, yeah, spell attacks work the same way as they do in 5e. We're good to go there. Now, I have already touched on it, I think twice, possibly just once. I might be a fool. But crits in this game, because it's a d12, are very much a thing. When you do crit, you have 3 options, right? You can either have the die explode, in which case basically you just get to roll another d12, right? You got a 12 on a d12, there you go. Let's explode that die, now you get another 12, and then maybe if that task was really difficult, now you have a chance at hitting it, which does have this fun little area where it implies that certain things can't be accomplished unless you crit and then rolled that second die and then still did well. I don't know how often that will come up, so I don't know how often this will end up being a useful mechanic. But if you think that the feat is going to be ridiculous and you rolled that 12, you might as well just roll another one, explode the die. That's my terminology, not here. And then not necessarily guarantee. You know what I mean? All but guarantee that you succeed. Alternatively, if you're just like, you know what, a 12 plus my modifier should be more than enough here, I'm gonna risk it. I don't need to go for that option. I just want a fate point, right? Those fate points can be cashed in at any time. Well, maybe not at any time. It depends on the effect, I believe. But those fate points can be cashed in later. They are a very good resource. They allow for a lot of versatility on the player's part. Beyond just the die exploding to increase accuracy or likelihood of success, there's a secondary option before you get to that default of grab the fate point, right? Some abilities or spells or whatnot might have what's called a critical effect. And if it has that, you can, of course, trigger that critical effect. Maybe that involves like the spell exploding and hitting other people within a radius around that target, right? That, I don't know if that's a thing or not, but that sounds like a plausible critical effect for me. So there you go. Maybe you're just like, you know what? That kobold sure is surrounded by like 5 other kobolds, and my critical effect here lets me do AoE damage to all of them. So as much as I'd like that fate point, I think I'm doing the critical effect, because then it's just going to damage all those kobolds, and that's a good time to use that, right? Assuming that you don't need to have the die explode, and assuming that you don't have a critical effect, you grab that fate point, which can be cashed in later. I'm not going to go down the list, but these are all very useful. I don't know exactly how balanced they are. Again, this is very much still a system in playtesting. It looks good to me, and I assume it's well thought out, but we'll have to wait and see. That being said, mechanically, I think this is sound, right? You have a fun system where you do have an increased crit rate, yes, but those criticals, they don't necessarily go into extra damage. They go into either a resource to be cashed in later that you can stockpile up, or they have like a small momentary boost to accuracy or whatever the fun little effect of that weapon or spell or whatever it is, right? The crits are more balanced because they're going to be more frequent. But then, like, even if that stuff seems underwhelming, you can still cache it for later and do something really cool. So I think that no matter what, when you crit, it's going to be rewarding without being busted and overpowered. That's what I feel this whole fate point increased crit rate sort of dynamic does for this system, and I'm very excited to see it in action. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, especially from the player's perspective, because then they get that choice of, oh, I have 4 fate points. Do I just want to, like, you know, make my attacks more accurate by cashing them in one at a time? Or do I want to go for one of those big -4 fate point effects, right? It's a very much like another area that I was kind of talking about earlier, where it's just like we're giving the players so many, okay, not so many options, because if you give them so many options, they'll get overwhelmed, right? But we're giving the players more options to make clutch decisions, to feel good about their involvement in the game, to feel as though they won, right? A returning rule that I'm sure swashbuckler fanatics are going to be very pleased about, not necessarily the 5e archetype, but, the general concept. Dual wielding is a thing. You can have one sword in one hand, one sword in the other hand, and it's still useful. The dual wielding system calls upon weapon size to determine what sort of penalty there is. But by default, whenever you take the attack action, you then make attacks with both your weapons, right? So if you've got a long sword in one hand and like a short sword in the other, you attacked, cool, you're attacking with both of them. Maybe not at the exact same time. It could be like slice. Flavor is free, right? What the mechanic checks for applying penalties isn't what the main hand is, right? In 5e, you need to have a light weapon in both hands in order to properly make this work, unless, of course, you have one of those exception feats or features. And then the offhand has a penalty, again, unless you have that fighting style that gets rid of that. You know what I mean, right? In this particular case, your main hand doesn't matter. It can be whatever weapon you want. What matters is the size of your offhand weapon. If that offhand weapon is small, so like a little quick dagger you can stab them with or something like that, you don't have any penalty at all. If the weapon is medium, then the die gets decreased. It moving down to a D10, not an extreme decrease by 2 degrees. I know we've had a few mechanics that have done that so far. This is just a 1 die decrease. So a D10 is still more than reasonable. That's just removing the potential of 2 numbers. I can't phrase that right now. And it also removes your ability to crit. So not being able to crit with that offhand does hurt a little bit, but it's not the end of the world, right? Assuming you still have a solid might modifier, you're still good to go. You shouldn't have to worry too much about that medium downgrade. It's a lot more merciful. If the weapon is large or giant, which I do love my oversized weapons, then it can't be wielded in your offhand. If it has like a special effect says otherwise, great. But by default, it's got to be a small or medium weapon. You can't have the big bop. I wish you could have the big bop, but you can't have the big bop. Maybe that's a fun little class or archetype or choice, whatever the term is, that I can homebrew in at some point in time. That would make me very happy to be able to do the big bop and then the other big bop. Big bops aside, you can only strike true if there's nothing in the way. Here's where we get into cover rules. They divide it into 3 categories: partial cover, significant cover, and total cover. I like this because it's not like half cover or 3/4 cover, and we don't have complicated numbers to deal with, and I have a hard time remembering it. I hate cover rules in 5e. Here, it's still an obstacle. It's still going to take some getting used to, but it's a lot more approachable in my opinion. So, partial cover and significant cover and total cover, those are kind of judgment calls. It's no longer not percentage-wise, fraction-wise, which is percentage-wise. You get what I mean. The verbiage here is a lot more conducive towards people being able to ascertain what degree of cover they have. Is it partial? Is it significant? Is it total? If it's just partial, they get a +1 to AC against those attackers. If it's significant, they get a +2. If it is total, they can't be attacked. Some spells or abilities might get around that, but by and large, they can't be attacked, which is kind of like a given. If they've moved to the other side of a wall, you're not going to be able to hit them through that wall, unless that exception is that I activate my Ghost Arm ability, and I can now Ghost Arm through the wall and slap them on the face, right? That certainly could be a fun option. But by default, you don't all have Ghost Arms. Only some. Only the special ones have the Ghost Arm. And then we get to the end of the document where they just kind of threw all their extra little stuff here. They do talk about damage calculations as far as monsters go. It looks like an okay system. As a DM, I have some concerns, but I think I'll manage. At the very least, it's in the playtesting phase. I'm going to give it a shot. Creature sizes. Creature sizes are pretty much the same as before. There's some minor differences. You can skim through the area if you'd like. There's supposedly some mechanics that interact with it, like shoving and telekinesis. I mean, shoving does. That's not supposedly. That's stated in that section. But telekinesis is another one of those things they were just like, this exists. Cool. Sizes exist. It's as usual, in my opinion. Same with currency. 1 platinum, 10 gold. 1 gold, 10 silver. 1 silver, 10 copper. Pretty consistent math. Very much in line with 5e. I did notice they left out Electrum. And I appreciate that. Electrum is not in here by default, so we don't have to deal with that nonsense. No more Electrum at our tables. No, we don't want your fake money. Take your fake money somewhere else. You see, Electrum is not real. It is a figment of your imagination. If someone tries to sell you something for Electrum pieces, don't trust them. Just don't. Go talk to your fun dwarf buddies. Tell them that someone was trying to con you using Electrum pieces, and then you and your dwarf friends can come and break their knees. That's how you handle people that peddle in Electrum pieces. Capiche? Very good. Now we can move on to the resting segment. There is an equivalent to long rest in this game. They call it the day's rest, or the night's rest. It does still take 8 hours. It's like the long rest. It does specify that it heals the damage they have and other things, but I'm confused about that because there's a section above that implies that at the end of combat, damage heals. Damage isn't tracked in between instances of combat. What is tracked is afflictions. That afflictions are the big lingering thing, and the damage is just a passing concern, right? But then, of course, this wording here implies that it doesn't heal in between combat, and it heals here. Because why would they have damage to heal here if it had already healed when they got out of combat? Because you'd think that they don't rest in the middle of combat, right? So, I don't know. Hey there, future Derek here. I already covered this section earlier. It's next to the Toughness section. If you've been skimming this video, I'm sorry, but sometimes continuity is a little bit important. You'll have to back up, or here's the little Discord message. We can resume now. Bye. What is more clear is their downtime system. It seems like their default downtime option is full rest. What that means is you take that week doing some light activities. And for the most part, like you are recovering from your grievous wounds. This is your chance to heal afflictions. Again, I don't know if there's going to be any class abilities that will allow you to heal afflictions, but assuming there isn't, this is where you do it. You take some downtime, you take, 3 weeks off, and you heal off all your stuff. For each week spent doing your full rest, you get to remove 1d4 afflictions without consuming any healing items or requiring special assistance. There we go. I got through it. So in my book, like let's say that you'd racked up like you're playing Jasper, let's say, and you're close to your 9 afflictions, or let's say you did reach those 9 afflictions, but your party was able to protect you before they stepped on your head and they dragged you out of the dungeon. Well, now poor Jasper needs to try and heal off those 9 afflictions. Let's say you take 3 weeks off, right? And you roll well enough on your d4s that now your afflictions are gone. Bada bing, bada boom, there you go. You're good to go. Your buddies, though, they could either take downtime alongside you and just put their adventuring career on pause. Again, if things are time sensitive, then this might be a cool opportunity for Jasper's player to bring in a different character that then joins the party for that time sensitive event while Jasper is sidelined. Which again, I've already talked about. I very much like. But if not, if they are at a point in their adventuring career where they're just like, you know what, Jasper's got the right idea. Let's just chill for a little bit. Maybe some of them have some afflictions to heal off, so they also take that full rest activity. If not, they could take any sort of other downtime activity. So far, there's not like set mechanics for that. That's still very much in the works. There's an area in the designer notes saying that like they might have set activities tied to set classes. An example they give is that an assassin could be able to craft potions, an enchanter could do some enchanting. It's very much a work in progress type thing. For the time being, what I would recommend is either make up sorry, I can't say that word. Make stuff up. There we go. Gotta make YouTube happy. Or steal from 5e. Xanathar's Guide to whatever, everything. I can't find my book right now, and I'm drawing a blank. But it's Xanathar's Guide to something, right? It has a section in downtime activities. I think it's downtime. Rules are pretty solid. A lot of them also take about a week, which is very much in line with this system. You could easily steal from there while you wait for more official rules to come out. Alternatively, if you are making stuff up, it could just be a matter of, hey DM, I want to do crime. What do I have to roll to do crime? I'm like, okay, well, how you go about doing this crime? I'm thinking some kind of bank heist, maybe? All right, cool. Give me a precision check to sneak into the bank. They roll a precision check. They pass by your arbitrary ruling. Cool. You're in the bank. You're at the vault. It is locked. How do you plan to break into it? Let's say they are a mage and they're just like, I teleport into it. There you go. Very good. All right, you are now inside of it. Do you have multiple uses of that spell within a short time period normally? Maybe they say yes, maybe they say no. It's like, okay, cool. You are now trapped in the vault with a bunch of gold. First of all, how do you collect that gold? And they say, okay, I have a bunch of sacks. I put it in my sacks and I slug them over my shoulders. All right, very cool. All right, how do you break out of there? Again, maybe they can just teleport back out of there, or maybe they have to pick the lock from the inside. Maybe it's not locked from the inside, and there's just a boop, like a button that'll open up, and they can go right back outside, and everything's fine. Maybe pushing that button from the inside sets off an alarm, right? There can be complications. There can be more checks. Long story short, Jim the Rogue spends the night in jail. Jim the Rogue got caught, and maybe that's the party's next adventure, is breaking Jim the Rogue out of jail, right? Maybe that's where he spends the rest of his downtime, and it just so happens to be that his prison sentence is the exact same length of time that the party took doing their rest, and that's Jim's penalty for risking this heist and failing, right? That's an example of how you could just make stuff up depending on what the player is interested in. That to me sounds entirely plausible, regardless of how you want to run that. But it could be something else, right? Like one of the players is like, I want to make some armor, or I want to find out if there's any kind of dragon slaying weapon around here. I know that our problem is dragons, right? Is there anything we can do to give us an edge there? Or I know our problems are copyrighted monsters with tentacle faces that do psychic stuff, right? I know that that's our big threat. Is there any history of an invasion in the past? Did they have any kind of weapons to combat them? Do we know of any sort of relics in the past that shielded our minds from that sort of influence? If now that we know what the big bad of the campaign is, can we defend ourselves against that? And then they'll go to the library. Maybe that's what their downtime activity is you have them make a knowledge check. Or actually, no, this would be, what's it called? The not charisma. I think it was cleverness or something along those lines. This could be their cleverness check, right? Where they see how quickly they're able to learn and understand things, right? Or it could be knowledge. I don't know. Either might be applicable here. You could steal rules from somewhere else. You have options. And I'm not just talking about 5e. I'm sure there's plenty of other systems out there that have downtime rules. Heck, like that existed back in the day. I'm sure there was all sorts of old school stuff you could steal from as well. Anyways, you get what I mean, right? You've got this downtime you could use to spend stuff. And then this downtime activity of the full rest of heal off afflictions could be a good excuse to have the players create backup characters so that when their character inevitably dies, they don't feel as bad. It kind of just still depends on the type of campaign you're playing, but I'm of the opinion that that players be allowed to die, that a character's will and plans are allowed to go unfinished, that the party may inherit that character's grief, that they can still honor that character by going on and fighting in their name, or perhaps their death was in sacrifice and they are a martyr. There's a lot of different ways to make death matter. That could be a video in its own right that I'm more than willing to make. But regardless, assuming that your DM is remotely experienced at all, or at the very least, like, has given death some thought and can find a way to make that death scene feel meaningful, between that death being made meaningful in some way within the next couple sessions, as well as that that player being able to bring in a new character that was probably already connected to the party through that whole resting ordeal, that should very much take the sting off from death and make DMs a lot less afraid, or I guess I should say, it should make novice DMs a lot less afraid to kill player characters. Again, I'm not advocating for killing your PCs. Don't kill your PCs. Try your best not to kill your PCs. But it does happen. Assuming that you're not fudging every single roll, it does happen. All right? And it's just an inevitable part of the game, especially in this system where I do think that it's okay. It's a lot more deadly than 5e. By how much? I don't know, but by a margin of a lot. Especially in a system like this where it is significantly more deadly, it will happen, and you do need to like make sure your players know that. It's like, okay, this isn't going to be like a Critical Role type thing where everyone gets their arc. Your character is allowed to die. You are allowed to get yourselves in over your head. A lot of the world will be balanced for you, but not all of the world. There will be times where you need to retreat, and you need to be ready to retreat. There are going to be some very intense moments where you live or die based off of the decisions you make. I'm trying to prepare you for that. Is that still something you're on board with? And maybe some players leave, and maybe that's something you're fearing, and it makes you very upset and whatnot, but I would wager that the overwhelming majority of your players don't leave, and that most of them are totally on board with that. Again, there are some extreme cases. There's a lot of soft players, I'll say, in like the new player ecosystem, right? That are new to the hobby, that don't really understand that death is okay, and that death is an opportunity to bring in a new character, and that death is an opportunity to add character to the surviving party members, right? That's now something that they have to live with. I don't know. I think death in tabletop RPGs can be a beautiful thing, and I'm very glad that not only does this system encourage, well, not encourage, but readily allow the DM to kill the PCs, but it also encourages the DM to handle it well. The mechanics themselves make it so that when death occurs, there was an element of randomness to it, and it was handled well in a way that the player characters had control over. So there's already that bit that like makes them not like immediately blame the DM, right? The mechanics themselves make it so the death is already handled well, and then beyond that, there's also that role play aspect of the mercenary had already gone on an adventure with them. Now the mercenary is a full-time operative. I'm already happy with my new player character, ideally. What was it? John? Was that the example name I gave out before? And even though John is dead, it's okay because there's a little bit of John in all of us, and we will fight on, and we will go in and fight the copyrighted tentacle-faced monsters because our wizard went and did some studying, and now we know where to find an amulet of mind protection. Sorry, amulet. There we go. Amulet of mind protection. Maybe a circlet too. Right? That'd be a good example of how this system could be used to encourage that sort of storytelling. Which at the end of the day, that's what we come to tabletop games to do, right? We come here for fellowship and to work together to tell a story, right? This isn't the DM writing a book. If the DM wanted to write a book, he could just write a book, right? This is us coming together to tell a story. What the players do matter. And in my opinion, the text, or at least the core rules here, are conducive towards making the players feel as though their actions in this world matter. And I can't stress enough how much that makes me happy. Because there's a lot of aspects of 5e that make it feel as though it doesn't matter, that this system addresses, and I'm very much enjoying that. It's the end of the video, so I'm allowed to shill. Feel free to hit all the happy YouTube buttons. Do check out the Relic system. That's the entire reason I made this. If you do nothing else, check that out. There'll be a link in the description. Feel free to check out their little sci-fi thingamajigger as well. It does look interesting. Sci-fi is not my cup of tea. Well, usually. Sometimes it is. But it does seem like they're on the right track there. And I very much like this system, and I'd like to see how they adapt that sci-fi kind of flavor to this system. Because it does seem like they did a good job of making Relict a fantasy-first type system. I have noticed some, like, flavor-agnostic terminology here and there. I'm just like, I see what you did. You're future-proofing this. This could be applied to sci-fi scenarios as well. Very clever. So I don't know. I don't know where I was going with that. But beyond that, they need information, right? They need people to play test. That's the other reason why I'm making this video, and probably some more. I don't know. We'll see where that goes. Is that I want to encourage people to run and to play test this system, because that's how we're going to get information. We do need people like me willing to sit down and scrutinize it and then go and play test. And even without play test, you could still like come up with little ideas. Like just making this video, I noticed like 3 different things I needed to go and ask clarifications for. At this point in time in filming, I've already gotten 2 of them clarified. Ooh, I just got added. Just as I was bringing that up, that's probably the 3rd clarification. I was wrong. That was not the clarification. But ideally the clarification came, and you already know that. So, anyways, they seem pretty nice. Feel free to join the Discord. It sounds like there's, I don't know. At the very least, I've been active so far. I would love to have this video have inspired more people to have stopped by and begin theory crafting mechanics and figuring out what sort of fun things we can do with this system. Right? I don't know. It's the end of the video. I've been filming for like over 3 hours now. I'm allowed to be a little bit loopy, I think. Just do what you can to help this system out. If you can signal boost it, great. I like it. I think it deserves to be out there. I think more people should be. I think it deserves to be on the radar of more people. I think that it deserves more people playing it. I think this deserves more people playtesting it. I think that they deserve more people sending them all sorts of stuff, right? All sorts of ideas. They also have professed that they do plan to have an OGL when they're ready to do that, so that you could write third-party content for it. They very much are opposed to the current OGL nonsense that's going on during the recording of this video. And I think that they will do right by us in that contract. So they definitely have ambitions to make this a maybe not big, maybe it just still ends up being like a niche system, but at the very least a system that you could write for, that people could have fun in, that might become like an actual thing someday, right? I don't know if it's going to become a thing or not. Regardless of whether or not it becomes a big thing, I'm definitely going to play in it. I'm definitely going to write in it. Well, okay, I can't guarantee I'm going to play in it. I got to find a DM, right? But at the very least, as a DM, I can run it. That much I can guarantee. And I'm very excited to do so. There we go. That's a good end point. Push happy buttons. Goodbye.